The sun was dropping low over San Antonio, turning the horizon into a blur of rust and gold. The air was heavy, almost syrupy, carrying the faint scent of river mud and magnolia. It was the kind of evening when the town slowed to a crawl, children chasing the last light, porch fans humming, the day exhaling its heat. From the open doors of St. Luke's Baptist Church drifted the soft rhythm of a hymn. Inside, the youth choir had just finished rehearsal. Laughter echoed off the wooden pews as the last of the girls packed up their songbooks. Among them was 17-year-old Mary Ellen Cooper, the preacher's daughter, whose voice was clear enough to silence a room. She waved goodbye to her friends, wheeled her bicycle out onto the dusty lot, and promised to be home before supper. Outside, the air pressed against her skin. She pushed off from the curb, tires crunching over gravel, and coasted down River Road where the trees arched overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. Fireflies blinked above the ditches, and somewhere in the distance, the church bell marked 7 o'clock. No one saw what happened after that. At home, Helen Cooper set the dinner table, 3 plates, 3 glasses, a loaf of bread wrapped in a towel. Her husband, Reverend Charles Cooper, was still at the church locking up hymnals and turning off the lights. He took pride in leaving the sanctuary spotless, even if it meant walking home after dark. By 8:30, Mary Ellen's plate was still untouched. The roast cooled on the counter. Helen looked at the clock again and again, her fingers worrying the hem of her apron. She told herself choir practice must have run late. She told herself her daughter had stopped to talk with friends. By 9, she stopped telling herself anything. When Charles stepped through the door, she was already on the porch, scanning the street. The porch light buzzed above her. "She's not home," she said. He frowned, set down his Bible, and called out his daughter's name into the thick night air. His voice carried down the empty block, swallowed by the sound of cicadas. At 10:15, they drove the short route from the house to the church, headlights cutting through the trees. Halfway down River Road, Helen pressed her hand to the window. "Stop." The car rolled to a halt. On the shoulder, half hidden in the shadow of a pecan tree, stood Mary Ellen's bicycle. It was upright, the kickstand steady in the dirt, as if she had simply stepped away for a moment. The front wheel turned lazily in the warm breeze. Helen got out first. Her shoes sank slightly into the dust. Beside the bike lay a single white shoe, scuffed at the heel. Nothing else. No torn fabric, no signs of a fall. Just that shoe and the low hum of insects. Charles knelt beside the bicycle, his hands trembling as he brushed dust from the frame. Her name was etched faintly beneath the seat, tiny letters carved with a pocketknife years before. They searched the road for an hour, calling until their voices cracked. Then they called the police. By midnight, 2 patrol cars and a half-dozen officers were combing the riverbank with flashlights. The beams darted through the reeds, catching on glass bottles and driftwood. Dogs barked in the distance. One officer found faint tire tracks that led toward the water but ended abruptly in loose soil. Helen stood near the car, arms wrapped around herself. The summer air no longer felt warm. Her husband paced, whispering prayers under his breath. Sheriff Walter Briggs arrived just before 1 in the morning, a stocky man with weary eyes who'd worked too many missing person calls that ended the same way. He crouched beside the bicycle, studied the undisturbed dirt, and murmured to his deputy, "Doesn't look right. Too clean." They widened the search until dawn. Nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no trace of struggle. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. When the sun rose, painting the river orange, the searchers looked defeated. The Reverend stood on the bridge, coat draped over his arm, watching the water slide by as though it might give her back. Helen remained by the tree, refusing to leave. By morning, news had spread faster than any official report. At the diner on Commerce Street, waitresses whispered between refills of coffee. The radio carried a short bulletin. Local teenager Mary Ellen Cooper missing after choir practice. Neighbors showed up at the Cooper home with casseroles and promises. Volunteers gathered at the church to form search lines. The pastor's wife led a prayer circle on the front lawn. Even strangers came to help. Farmers, students, soldiers home on leave, drawn by the story of the preacher's missing daughter. But beneath the prayers and casseroles ran a quiet fear that no one voiced aloud. If someone like Mary Ellen could vanish without a trace, what did that mean for the rest of them? Night after night, townsfolk left porch lights burning as if illumination alone could keep evil at bay. The sheriff's men kept searching, their flashlights bobbing along the river like will-o'-the-wisps. Weeks passed, then months. The cicadas died off, replaced by the low hum of autumn crickets. The church bell rang every Sunday, but its echo carried a different weight now. Families sat closer together in the pews. Mothers walked their daughters home. And on River Road, the pecan tree stood untouched, its roots gripping the place where the bicycle had rested. Inside the Cooper house, the table remained set for three. Dust settled on the unused plate, and every evening Helen wiped it clean and set it out again. She never moved it, as if one day her daughter would walk through that door, smile apologetically for being late, and finally finish her meal. If you can't stop thinking about her empty plate, hit subscribe. Don't let Mary Ellen be another name people forget. The search carried on long after the headlines faded. For weeks, the banks of the San Antonio River were combed by deputies and volunteers with lanterns that flickered like fireflies against the dark water. Each day began with fresh hope and ended with heavier silence. What had started as a rescue mission quietly shifted into recovery. Sheriff Walter Briggs kept his promise to the Cooper family. No lead would be ignored. But each call, each tip, seemed to echo the same hollow uncertainty. Neighbors repeated what they'd already told police. Friends replayed the night from memory, convincing themselves that one small detail might change everything. In the growing frustration, one name began surfacing again and again: Eddie Ray Nolan. Eddie Ray was 23, a mechanic at McAllister's garage, a few blocks from the church. He was known around town for fixing cars faster than anyone else, though not for talking much while he did it. Some said he was shy. Others said something about him just felt off. He lived alone in a small apartment above the shop and kept to himself. Mary Ellen's friends recalled how Eddie sometimes lingered outside after choir practice, leaning against his truck, pretending to tinker under the hood. One girl remembered him offering Mary Ellen a ride home once. She turned him down politely. Rumors filled the void facts left behind. Within days, whispers painted Eddie as obsessed. A man who watched from the shadows, who couldn't take no for an answer. Sheriff Briggs didn't like chasing gossip, but when 3 separate tips mentioned the same name, he paid the mechanic a visit. McAllister's garage sat on the edge of downtown, the scent of oil and gasoline hanging heavy in the air. Inside, Eddie worked beneath a lifted Chevrolet, his hands stained with grease, a cigarette balanced on the corner of his mouth. When he saw the sheriff step in, he froze mid-motion, eyes narrowing like a cornered animal. "Evening, Eddie," Briggs said, voice steady but probing. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Eddie wiped his hands on a rag. "About Mary Ellen, I reckon?" Briggs nodded. "When's the last time you saw her?" Eddie shrugged, glancing toward the open door as if considering escape. 2, maybe 3 days before she went missing. She came by with her daddy's truck, needed the oil checked. Briggs watched him closely. "You sure about that?" "Sheriff, I fix engines, not girls' problems," Eddie muttered, turning back toward the car. "She was kind to me. That's all." But Briggs noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw locked whenever her name was mentioned. Later that night, deputies searched Eddie's truck. In the glove box, they found a small notebook. Inside were sketches of Mary Ellen's face, crude, uncertain lines, and her name written several times across the back pages. That was enough to bring him in. The interrogation room at the Behar County Sheriff's Office was lit by a single fluorescent bulb that hummed overhead. The air felt close, the walls the color of damp paper. Eddie sat with his arms folded, eyes darting between the sheriff and the deputy taking notes. "Where were you between 7 and 9 the night Mary Ellen disappeared?" Briggs asked. "I told you," Eddie said, voice sharp. "I was at the shop. Working. Anyone see you?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Boss was out of town. I was alone." Briggs leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You expect me to believe that, with a girl missing and your notebook full of her name?" Eddie's voice cracked with anger. "It ain't what you think. I draw sometimes. Helps me think. That girl was kind to me when others weren't. I didn't hurt her." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. The sweat beading on Eddie's forehead wasn't from guilt alone, it was fear. But fear of what? After hours of questioning, nothing concrete surfaced. The notebook was strange, yes, but not proof. There was no witness, no weapon, no trace of Mary Ellen's scent or clothing in his truck. Briggs had seen liars before, but Eddie didn't fit the mold. He was either the most convincing, innocent man alive, or he'd done something unspeakable and buried it deep. By morning, Eddie was released. But in a town where truth and rumor weighed the same, his freedom didn't matter. At the diner, folks stopped talking when he walked in. The local paper ran a quiet line, "Mechanic questioned in Cooper case released without charge." It might as well have branded him guilty. He moved through town like a ghost, shoulders hunched, eyes avoiding every glance. His customers stopped coming by. The garage owner, under pressure from the community, let him go within a week. Meanwhile, the Cooper family closed themselves off from the world. Reverend Cooper still preached on Sundays, his voice steady but distant. His sermons turned heavier, more desperate. He spoke of forgiveness, of temptation, of unseen evils testing the righteous. The congregation listened in uneasy silence. Some nodded. Others whispered afterward, wondering if the Reverend spoke of his daughter's fate or something closer to home. Helen rarely left the house. When she did, she carried her Bible pressed tight to her chest, her eyes scanning faces like she was searching for an answer written somewhere among them. The search parties dwindled. The river grew quiet again. By late autumn, the posters had faded to pale ghosts on telephone poles. On Sunday mornings, when Reverend Cooper looked out from the pulpit, he could see what had replaced faith in his congregation's eyes. Not belief, not hope, but doubt. Every pew was filled, yet every soul seemed elsewhere, each wondering if the person beside them, the neighbor they'd known for years, might be capable of something dark. For a town built on faith, doubt had become the new religion. By the time the 1960s rolled across Texas, San Antonio was no longer the quiet city it had been. Neon signs began replacing church steeples as the skylines glow, and the soft hum of hymns gave way to jukeboxes and the hiss of soda fountains. Life, as it tends to do, moved on. But not for Helen Cooper. Every Sunday after service, she made the same walk, down River Road, past the pecan tree where the bicycle had once stood. The field there was empty now, tall grass bending beneath the wind, wildflowers blooming where the searcher's boots had trampled the soil years before. She'd stand at the edge of it, clutching her worn Bible, and whisper like someone in conversation. Neighbors pretended not to see her. Some said she was talking to the Lord. Others said she was talking to Mary Ellen. Either way, the habit stayed. Time hardened grief into ritual. Inside the Cooper house, the walls bore the weight of silence. Photographs of Mary Ellen remained exactly as they had been. Her graduation portrait in the hallway, her choir ribbon pinned to the curtain. Reverend Charles Cooper had once suggested they put the pictures away, to heal, he'd said, but Helen refused. So he buried himself in scripture instead. His sermons grew sharper, angrier. He spoke less of love and more of judgment, less of mercy and more of punishment. Congregants who had once found comfort in his words now shifted uneasily in the pews. Some whispered that his fire came from grief. Others whispered it came from guilt. He worked late into the night, lights still burning in his study long after midnight. When he did sleep, it was restless, dreams that left him sweating through his shirt, clutching his chest. Helen would sit by the window, listening to the sound of his unease and the echo of wind through the pecan branches outside. Sheriff Walter Briggs retired in '64. His hair turned the color of dust. On his last day, he unlocked the evidence room and looked at the cardboard box marked, "Missing Girl, 1959. He lifted the lid, stared down at the brittle papers, the faded photographs, the scuffed shoe wrapped in brown paper. He thought about burning it, setting it free, as if that might ease the weight of failure. But he didn't. He sealed the box again, placed it on the back shelf, and turned off the light. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with a glass of whiskey and whispered her name. It came out cracked, like a word that had been waiting too long to be spoken. Somewhere across town, Eddie Ray Nolan was packing his few belongings into an old Ford truck. He'd been laid off from yet another job. No one said why, but he knew. A man once suspected of killing the preacher's daughter didn't deserve a clean slate. He drove west first, then north, never farther than a tank of gas could take him. In each new town, the pattern repeated: curious looks, lowered voices, jobs that ended without reason. He never stayed long enough to unpack. By the time he hit 30, Eddie stopped introducing himself altogether. He became just the mechanic. He rented rooms under false names, drank alone, and learned to move quietly through the world. Sometimes, in the dim light of a motel, he'd open a worn photograph of Mary Ellen torn from an old newspaper clipping. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe to remember her kindness. Maybe to remember the way one small rumor had ruined 2 lives. As the years passed, the story of Mary Ellen Cooper drifted from tragedy to folklore. San Antonio expanded, swallowing farmland, paving the quiet dirt roads that once framed the case. Families moved in who'd never heard her name. But in the old neighborhoods, her story lingered. Parents warned their children to come home before dark. Teenagers dared each other to ride their bikes down River Road after midnight. Some swore they heard the faint ting of a bicycle bell carried on the wind, followed by a whisper in the trees. Every generation added something new, a detail that made it less real and more legend. Some said she'd run away. Others said her ghost guarded the church. What none of them realized was that the truth had never left. It had simply been buried deeper than anyone dared to dig. In 1972, the old pecan tree was struck by lightning. It split down the middle, the trunk smoking for hours before rain finally cooled it. A year later, the county cut it down for safety, leaving only a low stump and the memory of where a girl's bicycle once stood. Helen Cooper stopped visiting the site soon after. Her legs had grown too weak for the walk, and her mind had begun to blur around the edges of time. Some afternoons, she'd still set an extra place at the table, humming a hymn under her breath, convinced her daughter would come through the door any minute. Reverend Cooper continued preaching until his voice gave out. His last sermon, delivered to a sparse congregation in 1979, was about forgiveness. He spoke softly that day, eyes downcast, hands trembling on the pulpit. Some thought it was age. Others thought it was confession. By the time the century turned, few in San Antonio remembered the name Mary Ellen Cooper. The evidence box still sat in the same corner of the sheriff's archive, now coated in decades of dust. It was one of hundreds, forgotten crimes, faded faces. But stories like hers don't die. They wait. And one hot morning, in the summer of 2002, a construction crew digging a foundation on River Road hit something solid. Something that wasn't rock, or root, or metal. The foreman knelt, brushed away a handful of clay, and froze. Bone. The story had faded, until a construction crew, decades later, dug up the truth. Generations dared each other, but who dared speak the truth? Subscribe if you refuse to let silence win. The morning heat rose early that July day in 2002. By 8 o'clock, the air around River Road shimmered like glass, the sound of machinery echoing across what used to be the quietest part of town. A construction crew had been hired to clear a narrow plot just 3 blocks from the old St. Luke's Baptist Church. The foreman, Tom Alvarez, was pacing the site with a cup of coffee in hand when one of the backhoes jolted to a stop. Probably a root, the operator said, climbing down to look. But as he brushed the red clay aside, something white caught the sunlight. Smooth, round, too deliberate in shape to be stone. "Hey, Tom," the man called out quietly. "You better come see this." The foreman crouched, heart thudding as he brushed the dirt away with his gloved hand. The shape widened into the curve of a skull. He didn't speak for several seconds. Then, almost reverently, he said, "Shut everything down." They found her after 43 years, yet many acted like it never happened. If you won't look away, subscribe and share this video. The police arrived within the hour. The site was cordoned off. Workers gathered along the edge, their voices low and uneasy. To most of them, it was just another construction delay. But for a few older residents watching from the sidewalk, something about the location felt familiar. One woman whispered, "That's near where that preacher's girl went missing." Another crossed herself. Detectives moved carefully, marking each piece of exposed soil. As the rest of the skeleton emerged, it became clear that whoever this was had been buried quickly, shallow, unceremonious. No coffin, no care. Among the fragments, an investigator lifted something small from the dirt, a delicate silver cross, its surface dulled by time. When they rinsed it under bottled water, faint engraving caught the light. MEC. Someone murmured, Mary Ellen Cooper. News spread fast. Within hours, satellite vans lined River Road, cameras trained on the dig site. Reporters repeated the words that sent a chill through every living witness of 1959. Human remains found near the church. The San Antonio police confirmed it later that evening. DNA results would take time, but preliminary analysis suggested the remains belonged to a teenage girl. The necklace all but sealed the assumption. Inside a nursing home on the west side of town, Walter Briggs, now 85, sat in his recliner watching the news unfold on a flickering television. The anchor's voice was calm, factual, but to Briggs, every word carried 43 years of guilt. He leaned forward, gripping the arms of his chair as the screen showed the cross resting on an evidence tray. He whispered to no one, I knew she was close. The nurse on duty found him later still staring at the screen, tears streaking the lines of his face. By the end of the week, forensic teams confirmed what the town already believed. The DNA matched a surviving sample taken years ago from Helen Cooper's comb, kept by chance in the archives. After 4 decades, the missing girl had been found. The discovery hit San Antonio like a memory unearthed too soon. Residents who once treated the story as legend began speaking about it again, their recollections suddenly sharpened by guilt and distance. They remembered where they were when Mary Ellen disappeared. They remembered the search parties, the preacher's trembling sermons, the strange quiet that settled over the church. Even those who'd moved away called relatives back home, their voices hushed. Did you hear? They found her. After all these years. The story ran on every local station, then national outlets picked it up. Cold case cracked. Missing teens' remains found after 43 years. River Road, long forgotten by city planners, became a pilgrimage site for curiosity. People left flowers by the construction fence, strangers praying beside lifelong residents. Helen Cooper had passed away years earlier, never knowing her daughter's resting place. Reverend Cooper, too, had died before the truth surfaced. Their graves became part of the renewed fascination. The preacher's legacy now discussed in whispers. Imagine preaching about salvation, one man said at a diner, with that kind of burden on your shoulders. But as quickly as the town united in grief, speculation followed. Who had buried her there? Was it Eddie Ray Nolan, the mechanic everyone once blamed? Someone else? Theories multiplied. Talk radio revived the old case files. Retired detectives were interviewed. A few citizens demanded the investigation reopen. It did. Detective Renee Castillo, a rising name in the Bexar County Sheriff's Department, was assigned the case. She was known for her precision, her unwillingness to accept convenient truths. On her first day reviewing the file, she noticed how thin it was for such a famous case. A handful of notes, faded photographs, and the evidence list signed by Walter Briggs himself. In the inventory margin, next to the silver cross entry, a small mark caught her eye, a check beside the word duplicate. That word shouldn't have been there. There was never a second pendant in the original report. She turned the page, frowning. Another note from 1959, handwritten in Briggs's slanted cursive. Item returned to father per request. Returned? To the Reverend? Renee stared at the page, her pulse quickening. That night, while the rest of the department celebrated the closure of a historic mystery, she sat alone under the cold fluorescent light. The old evidence spread across her desk. She began cross-referencing every item, the photographs, the logs, the interviews. Patterns started to emerge where others had seen none. Someone had known exactly where to look in 1959. Someone close. And as the pieces shifted into focus, she realized the real story hadn't ended with Mary Ellen's discovery. It was only beginning. But when Detective Renee Castillo reopened the file, she found something everyone else had missed, something that made her blood run cold. The first time Detective Renee Castillo opened the Cooper file, she expected the usual pattern, a half-century-old mystery so weathered it would crumble in her hands. Instead, she found a puzzle that felt deliberately unfinished. The folder was thin, far too thin for a case that had once swallowed an entire town. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the photographs ghosted with time. Mary Ellen's smiling face looked out from beneath a paperclip, her choir dress bright, even in faded black and white. A tag read simply, "Missing Girl, 1959. Renee sat alone in the archive room that morning. The hum of the ventilation fanned the only sound. She'd made her name on cases like this, the kind that everyone else had given up on. To her, time didn't erase truth, it only buried it deeper. She started reading. The first thing she noticed was what wasn't there. No autopsy from 1959, just one conducted after the remains were found. No formal witness list, only scattered interviews without signatures. And on one evidence page, a peculiar note. Item number 3, Silver Cross, MEC. Duplicate returned to family per request. Returned? To whom? The only family alive in 1959 had been the Coopers. She wrote the name Reverend Charles Cooper in her notebook and underlined it twice. Eddie Ray Nolan was the logical place to start. Every story she'd read about the case led back to him. The young mechanic with the drawings, the obsessed admirer. It was convenient, almost too tidy. She pulled his record first. Death certificate, 1989, stroke. No wife, no children. She jotted the details down, disappointed. No confession to extract, no interview to compare. But the state files revealed something else. After his release in 1959, Eddie Ray had been picked up several times for vagrancy, moving from town to town. None of the charges stuck. Yet each arrest report noted the same pattern. Subject mentions San Antonio repeatedly. Unstable fixation with past case. Renee leaned back in her chair. The man had never escaped the accusation. She closed the folder and whispered to herself, and maybe he wasn't supposed to. 2 days later, she drove to the old St. Luke's Baptist Church. The building still stood, though its paint had blistered under decades of sun. Dust coated the stained glass windows, muting what had once been light. Inside, the air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of hymnals and disuse. The caretaker, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Torres, met her near the pulpit. "I remember the Reverend," the woman said softly. "Kind man. But after the girl disappeared, he changed. Used to pace the aisles after service, talking to himself." "About what?" Renee asked. Mrs. Torres hesitated. "He said he'd lost his calling. Said forgiveness was harder when it's yourself you need to forgive." The words lingered long after Renee left. Back at her desk, she began mapping the timeline. Mary Ellen vanished in late July. Reverend Cooper took a 6-week leave of absence beginning early August. The official record called it medical rest. She requested the hospital logs from Dallas, where the Reverend had supposedly stayed. They came back thin, too. No admission form, no medical notes. Just a single billing entry marked donation. Then she saw it. The check had been drawn from the church's account, signed by Reverend Cooper himself. So much for being a patient. That evening, she reopened the witness statements from 1959. One name caught her attention, Gerald Boyd, then a gas station attendant. His account had been dismissed as unreliable. He'd claimed to see a green Studebaker parked near the church between 7 and 8 p.m. the night Mary Ellen vanished. At the time, police assumed it was Eddie Ray's. But the car's description didn't match the one Nolan owned. His was a blue Chevy pickup. Renee pulled vehicle registration records from that year. One green Studebaker was registered in the area, to Charles Cooper, pastor of St. Luke's Baptist Church. The pen paused in her hand. The discovery wasn't proof, not yet, but it shifted the story's center of gravity entirely. She imagined the Reverend driving that road the night his daughter disappeared, the headlights catching the curve of her bicycle wheel, the pecan tree looming. What had happened in those missing minutes? The file didn't say, but something inside her whispered that the answer was never lost, only protected. The next morning, she visited the nursing home where Sheriff Briggs had spent his last years. The staff allowed her into his old storage locker, a narrow metal cabinet filled with keepsakes, photos, a deputy badge, a worn Bible, and a cigar box sealed with tape. Inside the box were case notes in his handwriting. Most were identical to the official file, except one torn page that stopped her cold. It read, "Reverend requested item number 3 be returned." Said it belonged to his wife. claimed she needed closure. Couldn't tell if he meant closure or silence. Renee stared at the words, feeling the same unease that must have haunted Briggs for years. She left the nursing home as the sun dipped low, the horizon turning a familiar rust and gold, a reflection of that first night back in 1959. Driving past River Road, she slowed near the spot where the construction tape still fluttered. The wind carried the faint sound of the river, the steady rhythm of a world that had moved on. But she knew better now. Some stories never end. They just wait for someone willing to listen. As she turned the car back toward town, one question kept circling her thoughts, sharper each time she whispered it aloud. The Reverend's sermons spoke of redemption. But what if he was the one who needed forgiving? The nursing home sat just outside San Antonio, surrounded by a low fence and a grove of tired oak trees. The sign out front read Morning Haven, the kind of name that promised peace to those who'd spent a lifetime carrying what couldn't be spoken. Detective Renee Castillo stepped through the automatic doors, the sterile scent of antiseptic mingling with the faint hum of gospel music from a nearby room. The receptionist looked up, recognizing her badge before she spoke. "You're here for Mrs. Cooper," the woman said softly. "She doesn't get many visitors." Renee nodded. "I just need a few minutes." Inside, Helen Cooper sat by the window in a thin cardigan, sunlight spilling across her trembling hands. Her hair was the color of snow, but her eyes, sharp, gray-blue, seemed untouched by time. She turned as Renee approached, a faint, polite smile curving her lips. "Mrs. Cooper," Renee began gently, "my name's Detective Castillo. I'm looking into your daughter's case." The old woman's smile faltered. "After all this time?" Renee set the folder on the table, sliding a photograph toward her. The silver cross, cleaned and shining once more, engraved with MEC. Helen stared at it for a long time. Then, without warning, her breath hitched. Her fingers, frail but steady, reached out and traced the outline of the cross. Her shoulders began to shake. "She wore it every Sunday," she whispered. "Her father gave it to her on her 13th birthday." Renee said nothing, only watched as the tears formed, slow and heavy. When Helen finally spoke again, her voice had changed. "Some things shouldn't be found, Detective. Some things are meant to stay where God left them." Renee leaned in slightly. "Did your husband ask for the pendant to be returned in 1959? Helen's gaze broke from the photograph. "He said it was for closure," she murmured. "Said I shouldn't ask questions. I didn't for a long time." That night, back at her office, Renee couldn't shake the echo of Helen's words. Some things shouldn't be found. She opened a new file labeled Reverend Charles Cooper. The trail led to a single entry in the church's financial ledgers, a donation made to a facility called the Christian Rest Home of Dallas, 6 weeks after Mary Ellen's disappearance. The note beside it read simply, "Exhaustion." She made the drive to Dallas the next morning. The facility had long been converted into an assisted living center, its records boxed and stored in a basement that smelled of dust and mildew. The administrator let her look through what remained. In an old logbook, between faded ink and coffee stains, she found it. Admitted, Charles Cooper. Occupation, pastor. Diagnosis, nervous exhaustion. Notes. Frequently prays aloud at night. Mentions daughter. Mentions sin. Requests private communion daily. Renee traced the last line with her finger. She closed the book slowly, her heart tightening. Back in San Antonio, she began pulling recordings from the church archives, reel-to-reel tapes kept by the congregation's historian. Most of the early sermons were calm, measured, typical of a small-town preacher. Then came August 1959. The tone changed completely. The Reverend's voice, once warm, carried a sharp edge. His sermon spoke of temptation in the home, the price of disobedience, and the cleansing power of suffering. Week after week, the words grew heavier. "The Lord tests the faithful," he thundered in one recording. "And when the faithful falter, they must be made new through repentance and pain." Renee stopped the tape. The words clung to the air like smoke. She replayed another sermon, dated September 1959, titled "The Daughter Who Strayed." "There are those who stray from grace," he said, his voice trembling. "And when they do, it is not the stranger who suffers most. It is the father who must bear the weight of her sin." Renee pressed pause. The silence that followed felt heavier than any confession. She looked up at the photograph of Mary Ellen pinned to her corkboard, the bright-eyed girl on her bicycle, unaware that the man preaching salvation might have been rehearsing his own absolution. The pieces began to form a shape too awful to ignore. The 6-week absence, the missing pendant, the changed sermons, the mother's silence. Renee picked up her pen, writing in the margin of her notes. He wasn't healing. He was hiding. Later that week, she returned to the nursing home. Helen sat in the same chair by the window, a small radio humming softly beside her. "Mrs. Cooper," Renee said gently, "when your husband left for Dallas, did he ever tell you what happened that night?" Helen didn't look up. "He said he tried to protect her, said she had made a mistake and that he'd taken care of it. I wanted to believe he meant something else." Renee's throat tightened. "Do you think he—" Helen raised a trembling hand. "I've had 40 years to think, detective, and every night, I hear him pacing. Even now, in dreams, asking God to forgive a sin no man could name." Outside, the afternoon sun dipped low, the color of rust on the horizon. Renee walked to her car, the wind rustling through the oaks that lined the street. She sat behind the wheel, staring at the steering column, her pulse still drumming with the echo of Helen's voice. The sermons, the guilt, the hidden cross, it all fit together now. Reverend Cooper hadn't been preaching to save others. He'd been speaking to the only person left who could hear his confession. The detective realized he wasn't preaching to his congregation. He was preaching to his own guilt. It began with a phone call from a thrift store clerk on the outskirts of San Antonio, the kind of place that smelled of dust, cedar, and forgotten lives. She told Detective Renee Castillo they'd received a donation box labeled Estate of Reverend Charles Cooper. The clerk had opened it to catalog the contents, but, inside, found a leather-bound journal and a few papers stamped personal. "Your department's number was written on the bottom of the box," she said. "I figured maybe it was important." Renee was there within an hour. The clerk led her to the back, where the box sat on a wooden table among chipped lamps and stacks of outdated hymnals. It was small, just big enough to hold a few keepsakes, and the cardboard had softened with age. Inside, wrapped in an old handkerchief, lay 3 items: a collection of journals, several folded letters, and a broken silver locket. The locket was delicate, tarnished, its hinge cracked. Inside was a faded photo of a young girl with soft eyes and a nervous smile. Mary Ellen Cooper. Renee set up the journals in the evidence lab, each one tagged and opened in sequence. The handwriting was tight and controlled, a pastor's neat cursive. But as the entries moved through 1959, the tone fractured. The words began to tilt, the ink pressed harder into the paper, as though the weight of guilt had seeped into every stroke. She wouldn't listen. I begged her to repent, but I went too far. Each sentence stood alone, surrounded by blank space, as if even the Reverend couldn't bear to write what came next. Renee flipped through more pages. The next entry was dated 2 days after Mary Ellen's disappearance. "The house feels quiet, but her voice is everywhere. I keep seeing the bicycle by the tree. I told Helen the Lord took her. She believed me. God forgive me." Her fingers stilled. The next page was empty except for a single line scrawled across the bottom. "Yar help me bury her." He owed me his silence. Renee froze. The initials could only mean one thing: Eddie Ray Nolan. She sat back, heart pounding, as the air in the room seemed to tighten around her. The line wasn't vague. It was an admission, not just of guilt, but of complicity and manipulation. It was the kind of evidence investigators dream of finding and dread reading. She copied the entries, logged the originals, and drove home in silence that night. Her apartment felt colder than usual, the city lights outside the window too bright. She made coffee she didn't drink, replaying the pieces in her mind. If the Reverend had confessed to killing his daughter, that was horrifying enough. But the second line changed everything. "Yar help me bury her." Had Eddie Ray known what he was covering up? Or had he been forced? And why would a man already accused of obsession risk his freedom to protect the very family that destroyed him? The next morning, Renee began tracking down any surviving relatives of Eddie Ray Nolan. His records showed no marriage, no children. But one next of kin still lived in Texas, a younger sister named Linda Nolan, age 78. residing in a small nursing facility outside Kerrville. Renee made the drive, the journal notes still echoing in her mind. Linda Nolan was sharp-eyed despite her age, her voice gravelly but firm. When Renee explained why she'd come, the woman's shoulders stiffened. "I always knew they'd find something," Linda said, staring past the detective toward the window. "Eddie wasn't what people said he was." "You're saying he didn't kill her?" Linda gave a bitter laugh. "Kill her? Lord, no. He loved that girl. Would have done anything for her." Renee leaned forward. "How do you know?" "Because she told me," Linda said. "They were seeing each other. Secretly. The Reverend didn't approve, so they kept it quiet. She'd sneak notes through me when I worked in town. Then one day, she showed up crying. Said she'd told her father she was expecting. Said he lost his temper. Told her she'd ruined him." Renee felt her stomach twist. "And Eddie? He went to the church that night," Linda whispered. "Said he had to make things right. But when he came home before sunrise, he wasn't the same. He never told me what happened, just that she was gone and he had to leave town. He carried that guilt till the day he died." Renee sat in her car afterward, gripping the steering wheel, the gravity of it pressing down. The Reverend's words, the sister's account, the evidence in the journals. It all converged into one unbearable truth. Mary Ellen hadn't been killed by a stranger or a jealous suitor. She'd died at the hands of her own father, a man so consumed by shame he'd rewritten the story to fit his image of righteousness. And Eddie Ray, branded a monster, had carried the secret to his grave to protect the girl he loved, and the church that would never have forgiven her. That night, back in her office, Renee opened the broken locket again. The picture of Mary Ellen had almost faded away. Behind it, tucked beneath the thin paper, she found a second, smaller image, a boy's face, barely visible. Eddie Ray. 2 photographs, side by side. A secret love story buried beneath decades of lies. Renee closed her eyes. In the quiet, she could almost hear the faint creak of a bicycle wheel turning somewhere down River Road. The reports would call Eddie Ray Nolan a suspect who died unproven. The files would call him a man of interest. But Renee knew better. He was a man who had carried someone else's sin until it consumed him. The Reverend's guilt had been written in sermons. Eddie's, in silence. The man they called a monster had only tried to protect the girl he loved and paid with his life. By the time Detective Renee Castillo reached the old Cooper house, evening light had turned the neighborhood gold. The property sat half-hidden behind overgrown hedges and a rusted gate, its shutters warped, its paint blistered from decades of Texas sun. A for sale sign leaned crookedly in the yard. The house hadn't been lived in for years. Helen Cooper had passed quietly in her sleep in 1996, and no one had touched her belongings since. The realtor's key turned stiffly in the lock. When the door opened, a wave of still air greeted her, a mix of dust, lavender, and the faint, dry scent of time. Renee paused at the threshold. Somewhere beyond the silence, she could almost imagine the echoes of what the house once held, a young girl laughing from the hallway, the distant hum of a hymn drifting from the study, the sound of dishes being set for 3. Now, there was only quiet. She walked slowly through each room. The furniture remained like relics of a life interrupted, framed photos on the mantel, a Bible left open on the coffee table, a half-finished embroidery project yellowed with age. Every corner felt sacred, like stepping into a preserved confession. Her instructions were simple: collect anything of evidentiary value before the property was cleared. But this wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about understanding why. In the study, dust motes drifted through shafts of light from a cracked window. Renee ran her gloved hand along the desk, uncovering faint circles where cups of coffee once sat. She checked the drawers, receipts, old sermons, faded envelopes. Then, as she pulled at the bottom one, it stuck. She leaned down, tugged again, and heard a faint pop as something dislodged behind it. A thin piece of wood slid free. Behind it, a narrow gap revealed a small space filled with cobwebs and a single yellowed envelope. It was sealed. Her pulse quickened as she carefully retrieved it, brushing away the dust. The handwriting on the front was elegant and deliberate. To Margaret, Waco, Texas. The postmark line was blank. The letter had never been mailed. She unfolded it gently. The paper crackled in her hands. The ink had faded to a soft brown, but the words were still clear, every stroke heavy with emotion. August 9th, 1959. Dearest Margaret, I can't look at Charles the same. He says God will understand, but I can't find peace. I know what he did, and I can't let it destroy what's left of this family. He says we must protect the church, that people wouldn't forgive us if they knew. I told him forgiveness isn't his to decide, but he won't listen. He prays and prays, yet the prayers sound hollow now. Sometimes, I think I hear her still, her bicycle bell on the road. Maybe that's God's way of reminding me this secret won't stay buried forever. Pray for me, sister. I no longer know who I'm trying to save. Helen. Helen carried this and never sent it. If you'd have told the truth, click subscribe. Help us hold communities accountable. Renee sat down hard in the wooden chair beside the desk, the letter trembling in her hands. For a long moment, she didn't move. The late sunlight reached through the window and touched the page, making the ink shimmer faintly, like something alive trying to breathe again. Helen Cooper had known. Not just suspected, not guessed, known. She'd lived with that truth for decades, eating dinner across from the man who killed their daughter, hearing him preach forgiveness to others while he drowned in his own guilt. And she'd kept silent, sealing her confession in a letter that never found its way to another soul. Renee exhaled slowly. The air inside the house felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves recognized what she was holding. She looked around the study again, noticing small things she'd missed before. The faint indentation of a missing photograph on the wall, the closed piano in the corner, the single dinner plate displayed in a cabinet. All those years, Helen had preserved the illusion of normalcy while living with a secret too dark to name. Renee imagined her sitting at that same desk decades ago, pen shaking as she wrote those words. Maybe she'd planned to send it. Maybe she'd hidden it at the last second, afraid of what it would mean if anyone ever read it. Maybe, deep down, she'd hoped someone would find it one day, when she no longer could speak. The truth wasn't just in police reports or old photographs. It was in this fragile piece of paper, folded and forgotten, carrying the weight of a mother's grief and complicity. Helen hadn't been innocent, but she'd been trapped, bound by love, by fear, by the expectations of a community that worshipped her husband more than they comforted her loss. The cover-up hadn't been orchestrated by corruption or money. It had been held together by faith, shame, and silence. Renee placed the letter back on the desk, staring out through the dirty window pane toward the fading light. The field behind the house stretched out toward the horizon, golden and endless, the same landscape that had once swallowed a girl and her secrets whole. She took a photograph of the letter, sealed it carefully in an evidence bag, and turned off her recorder. For the first time in months, she didn't feel satisfaction at solving a mystery. She felt sorrow, deep and unyielding, for the lives consumed by the lie. As she closed the door to the Cooper house behind her, the wind rustled through the dry grass, whispering faintly down River Road. It sounded almost like the turning of a bicycle wheel. And in that sound, Renee understood something that the files, the journals, and the testimonies had never captured. The truth had never been lost. It had simply been buried, just like Mary Ellen. By spring of 2003, the case that had once vanished into silence was back on every front page in Texas. For the first time in state history, a man was being indicted for murder posthumously. The announcement came on a humid Thursday morning. Cameras crowded the steps of the Behar County Courthouse as the district attorney faced a wall of microphones, his voice carrying over the static hum of reporters. The evidence is clear. Reverend Charles Cooper was responsible for the death of his daughter, Mary Ellen Cooper, in July of 1959. This is not about vengeance, he said. It's about truth finally having its day. The air in San Antonio seemed to shift. A man once praised for his faith, who'd baptized hundreds, who'd married and buried half the town, was now being named for what he truly was, a murderer. Inside the courthouse, Detective Renee Castillo stood among the cluster of journalists, her expression unreadable. The journals, the letter, the DNA, the locket, it was all there. Layer upon layer of evidence that had finally made the story impossible to deny. Yet as the reporters spoke into their cameras, turning tragedy into headlines, Renee couldn't shake the feeling that justice had arrived too late to change anything that mattered. At St. Luke's Baptist Church, the reaction came like a thunderclap. Within hours of the press conference, parishioners gathered in disbelief. Some refused to accept it, clutching worn photographs of the Reverend shaking hands, smiling behind the pulpit. Others stared silently at the sanctuary walls, realizing the man they'd once trusted with their confessions had carried a secret darker than any of theirs. The church board met that evening and voted unanimously to remove the Reverend's portrait from the lobby. The frame had hung there for 40 years, the first thing every visitor saw when they entered. 2 deacons took it down without a word. When the nails came loose, dust rained down from behind the frame, coating their hands like ash. One of them muttered, "Guess even saints leave stains." Television crews swarmed River Road, their satellite vans blocking traffic, reporters standing where the pecan tree once grew. They filmed the open field where Mary Ellen's bicycle had been found, now a fenced construction lot. The segment titles were all the same: Faith Betrayed. Renee gave only one interview, standing before the courthouse, her hair pulled back, her tone even but measured. For decades, this case was about a missing girl, she said. But it was never just that. It was about a community that looked away, a family that carried silence like scripture, and a man who mistook fear for faith. When asked if she believed justice had been served, she paused, her gaze distant. "Justice doesn't always wear a badge," she said quietly. "Sometimes it just wears time." The fallout spread quickly. Old church members began returning their tithes, some demanding public apologies. Others defended the Reverend fiercely, claiming the evidence was misinterpreted, that grief had been twisted into accusation. At the diner downtown, conversations turned bitter. One man slammed his coffee cup down and said, "He gave his life to God. You think he'd kill his own child?" Another replied, "You ever seen what guilt does to a man? He spent the rest of his life preaching at himself." The divide cut deep, even among families who'd once prayed side by side. For Eddie Ray Nolan's family, though, the news brought a kind of quiet redemption. At a small press gathering in front of the sheriff's office, Renee personally handed Linda Nolan, Eddie's sister, an official letter of apology from the Behar County Sheriff's Department. The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she unfolded the document. Her hands trembled as she spoke. "My brother wasn't perfect," she said softly, "but he wasn't a killer. He carried that lie to his grave because he loved that girl. I hope he can rest now." Renee placed a hand on her shoulder. He was braver than any of us realized. In the weeks that followed, the town tried to absorb the truth. But San Antonio, especially the East Side, never forgot what it had been asked to believe for so long. The Reverend's grave was quietly moved to an unmarked section of the cemetery. His name was removed from the plaque at St. Luke's. For some, that was enough. For others, it wasn't nearly close. Helen's grave, only a few yards away, began receiving fresh flowers from anonymous visitors. A note left once among them read, "She forgave him. We can't." For Renee, the case file closed not with triumph, but with quiet exhaustion. She returned to River Road one final time that summer. The construction site was finished now. A new row of houses stood where the field used to be, children's bikes lined up neatly in driveways. She parked by the curb, turned off the engine, and sat in the car, watching a boy pedal down the street, his bell chiming faintly in the distance. That sound, that innocent ring, was what Mary Ellen never got to have again. She thought of Helen's letter, of Eddie's silence, of the Reverend's sermons that now played like confessions, and of a town that had loved its illusion more than its truth. The wind shifted through the pecan trees, bending the grass in soft waves. Renee closed her eyes and let the stillness settle. The story had finally been told. The justice, imperfect though it was, had arrived. But she knew stories like this never truly ended. They linger, whisper, remind. But in San Antonio, even justice couldn't silence the whispers of River Road. The new families on River Road never knew what had happened there. To them, it was just another stretch of quiet Texas suburb, brick houses, trimmed lawns, the hum of sprinklers on summer mornings. But for the older residents, the place still breathed with memory. At the edge of the neighborhood stood an oak tree that had survived everything: storms, construction, time. Its branches reached wide and heavy, its roots tangled deep beneath the clay. To those who remembered, it was more than a tree. It was a grave marker, a witness, a reminder. Every June, locals came to tie white ribbons around its trunk, one for each year that Mary Ellen Cooper had been gone. The tradition had started small, with a few women from St. Luke's Baptist Church in the 1980s. After the truth came out, more people joined. By 2003, the oak was wrapped in pale strands that fluttered softly in the wind like whispers from another life. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying down the same road where a girl had once pedaled her bicycle for the last time. They knew the stories, half folklore now, but not the ache behind them. To them, River Road was safe, clean, ordinary. The elders let them believe it. Detective Renee Castillo parked at the curb that afternoon, stepping out into the slow warmth of early summer. The wind carried the scent of grass and river water. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed, and a dog barked lazily. She walked toward the oak, the crunch of gravel underfoot familiar now. The construction that had once unearthed Mary Ellen's remains was long finished. A new family lived there, unaware that the foundation of their home sat on ground that had once held secrets. The ribbons trembled as she approached. Renee knelt, brushing away dry leaves from the base of the trunk. She set down a small bouquet of white lilies, the same kind Helen Cooper used to plant in her front yard. For a moment, she stayed there in silence. "We found you, Mary Ellen," she whispered. "It took too long, but we found you." The wind stirred again, lifting a ribbon so that it brushed lightly against her arm. She didn't move. Standing, she looked up through the branches. The sunlight broke through in fragments, streaking the bark in gold. She thought about how far the story had reached, how a quiet tragedy had become part of the city's history. San Antonio had changed, but the echoes of what happened still rippled beneath its calm. Churches spoke more carefully now about faith and power. Reporters cited the case in lectures about institutional silence. Even the sheriff's department used it as a training example, how blind trust can bury truth deeper than any grave. Renee had seen dozens of cases since then, theft, fraud, murders that came and went with the headlines. But none had lingered like this one. None had carried so much silence. Because this wasn't just a story about a crime. It was a story about belief, how it can lift people, and how it can blind them. A car slowed nearby. An elderly man in a beige hat leaned out the window. "You knew her, didn't you?" he asked softly. Renee shook her head. "No, just her story." He nodded, eyes on the tree. "My mama used to say this road was cursed. I think she meant it was haunted by guilt." Renee smiled faintly. "Maybe guilt keeps places honest." The man tipped his hat and drove off, leaving her alone again with the rustle of leaves. She thought about Helen Cooper, writing that letter she could never send, about Eddie Ray Nolan, who carried another man's sin to his grave, and about the Reverend, standing before his congregation, shouting about redemption, while knowing the only person he couldn't forgive was himself. They were all gone now, but their choices had shaped everything that followed. Renee wondered if, in the quiet moments before his death, the Reverend had realized that the thing he'd feared most, the truth, was the very thing that might have saved him. That's what truth does, she thought. It waits. It forgives nothing, but it never stops calling. She turned back toward her car, the field stretching behind her in soft waves of green. The sky was beginning to dim, the light turning amber. As she opened the door, she looked once more at the oak tree. The ribbons swayed together, whispering in the warm wind. For a brief second, she could almost hear the faint ting of a bicycle bell somewhere in the distance. Light, rhythmic, eternal. The sound faded, but the feeling stayed. Renee took one last look and whispered under her breath, "Rest now." Then she got in the car and drove away. We found Mary Ellen, but how many others are still waiting? Subscribe and join us in telling the stories that the world should never forget.